Samantha, and I'll go ahead and get started and I'll share my screen. Let me just make sure that y'all can see that. Are you able to see that okay?
Yep.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, so thank you again to the Texas Homeless Network for inviting me back to do a similar presentation to what I did last year during the conference, but I'm just going to adapt it a little bit to be more updated. But again, my name is Sydney and I go by Sid, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer with the National Low Income Housing Coalition based out of Washington, D.C. And so I'll just be talking a little bit about how to engage your elected officials on housing solutions and different advocacy tools. And I'll also talk about our research, and then a little bit about the budget process at the federal level, because that's going to be very pertinent very soon. And yeah, I'll leave some time for questions at the end as well. So just really briefly, I do want to mention our agenda. I think I kind of just went through it, but again, here is what it'll look like. And then our mission is dedicated to achieving racially, socially equitable public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes have quality homes that are accessible and affordable in communities of their choice. And this was just a recent update too. I think we did it in the past 2 years just to make sure that it really encompasses the values of our coalition. And that coalition itself is made up of a wide variety of folks, and I definitely encourage you all to join as a member after this, and I can talk to y'all about that afterwards as well if you're interested. We have folks who work directly with low-income households and folks, and we also have developers, landlords, advocates, elected officials, housing authorities, folks from different sectors, so there's definitely a lot of different ways to get involved with us. So to begin, I'm going to go ahead and go over some of the highlights from our two main research reports that really just kind of drive our work and show why it's so important to focus on the lowest income households. So those reports are known as the GAP and Out of Reach. The first graph, and we're actually about to release an updated version of the GAP, but I can't share that information out publicly yet. So you're just gonna have to deal with the 2022 information. But the GAP report really just focuses on lower income renters, and it shows the shortage of affordable housing across the United States. And we know that that's where the greatest needs are based on this research. And by focusing on solutions for those households, we can also elevate housing issues further up the income ladder. So we're not saying that like very low income or like low income and middle income don't matter. It's just that we know that if we address those immediate needs at the extremely low income level, we can help folks further up the income ladder. And then I'll kind of go through our website after this in a bit so you can see where to find it on our website. And so in this graph that you see in front of you, you will see that most of the folks that have responded to the American Community Survey, which is where we get this data from, have responded to saying that they pay more than 50% of their income on housing costs. And the majority of the people who pay more than 50% are extremely low income and very low income households. And so that's not to say that folks like myself or folks who are like above median income are not cost burden, but they usually make up like a smaller chunk of like the population that pays more than 50% of their income on rent. And then I did just want to share this graph, which we actually did update for this year's report too, and it kind of almost looks the same, but I just wanted to share this graph, which indicates that the housing shortage for extremely low income renters from the 50 largest metros across the United States. And this graph, I really like it because it indicates how severe the housing shortage is for these households. And it's usually explained due to lack of subsidized affordable homes for extremely low income households. And so you'll see that older towns such as Boston, even though they still have a housing crisis, most of like their affordable housing is sustained through like subsidized housing, like public housing. but it's still so important to make sure that we're preserving it, which is why you're probably seeing like a housing crisis amongst extremely low income. Woo! I didn't mean to do that, but extremely low income households. And so in Austin in particular, you'll see, I don't think you'll see it in this graph, but I think it's like one of the points like down here, that 81% of extremely low income renter households are severely cost burdened, while like the HUD assisted available housing is only at about 4%. So it's somewhere like down here. I think it's this one. Cool. So then another popular report that we put out is Out of Reach, and this one came out in the summer of last year, I think late summer, early fall. And this report documents the high cost of housing. So it really just touches on the significant gap between renter wages and the cost of rental housing across the United States. And again, I'll show you how to get to that report in a quick second. But if you look at the graph on the slide, you'll see how much it costs to afford a 1 or 2 bedroom rental unit versus how much different occupations across the United States earn. So you'll notice that even the lowest like paid worker that we have on this graph doesn't even include the majority of minimum wage workers across the United States that are likely making less than $10 an hour. So we like using this graph as well because it captures the fact that even though rent increases and unemployment was also increasing for a while, and now we're seeing it kind of stabilize, wages are still not keeping up with the high cost of living. And then this graph is also from Out of Reach. So here's where you really see the intersection of housing and work, wages and labor, and that the real challenge is not that people aren't working, it's that the work that they're doing isn't paying the housing bills. So the fact that wages have remained stagnant, and especially for lower wage jobs, while rents have continued to increase due to increased demands and inadequate supply of affordable homes across our country, we see that folks aren't having like the access to housing that they should be. And so I think in Texas, you can see here, and this is like our most up-to-date number, by the way, but it costs 22.54, or you have to be making 22.54 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom rental home in Texas. And if that sounds a little bit outdated, that's because sometimes the formulas that HUD uses, or not the formulas per se, but like the data itself can be a bit outdated, but that's what we have for now. And so really quickly before I keep moving forward, I do want to just touch on how to get there on our website to see both research reports. So when you get to the National Low Income Housing Coalition website, you will see up here that we have Explore Issues, and we have Publications and Research over here, and we have both Out of Reach and The Gap. And so you can click either one and it'll take you to landing pages that look like this. This is Out of Reach, and this is The Gap. A lot of folks really like our Out of Reach landing page in particular because you can click View State Data here, and then you can kind of just select, we can select Texas, and you can see all these cool facts, but even better yet, you can see like everything kind of broken down. Oh, I don't know if you'll be able to see it here. I think it's a little bit further up, but if you download the state report here, like the Excel spreadsheet, it'll actually show it to you like based on like the top metropolitan areas and like counties and cities. So definitely worth looking at. And I'll go ahead and do this from the current slide. And I think the next one, does anybody have any questions before I keep moving forward? Cool. So just for Texas highlights really quick. Here's just a quick snapshot that you can pull from our website as well. So as you can see, 23% of renters in Texas are extremely low income, which means that they are at or below 30% of area median income. And that usually means that the maximum income that a family of four can make is 26K. So that would be categorized as being at 30% of area median income. So most of the time it means that if renters can find a home, they're usually in that rent burden category again, where they're spending more than 50% of their income on rent. And that leaves very little for emergencies. Um, People end up compromising other elements in their life. I'm sure you've probably heard of folks having their lights turned off or having to, miss a couple of other bills just because they can't pay for housing. This graph also demonstrates that those living in extremely low income households in Texas are not unemployed. So this part right here. And despite what the negative rhetoric might say about low income households, here we can see that almost half of these folks are like in the workforce, and others rely on subsidies such as SSI. And then the second part of the graph right here also shows that the supply of affordable and available homes in Texas are what are based like on their income. And it's clear here that the extremely low income households are struggling more to attain housing. And notice how this says like affordable and available, because this includes like the cumulative total of rental housing units. So what I mean by that is that some of like the numbers held between this 29 could be affordable, but some are probably in like deep need of being repaired in order for folks to live in it. So it doesn't necessarily make them available. And then this last graph right here really, again, just talks about the cost burden, and I did touch on that earlier, so I'll go ahead and move on. Ooh, any questions about that? Cool, I'll go ahead and move forward. So the budget process itself, and why I'm talking about it today, is because President Biden actually announced his budget earlier today, like literally not even an hour ago, I think. Just a little bit of what the federal budget process looks like. If you don't know what it looks like, it's kind of really good to know, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of advocacy or federal advocacy in the housing space. So within the federal budget itself, there's two different categories of spending. You have mandatory and discretionary spending. So mandatory spending does not need to go through any type of like congressional appropriation legislation, like it will automatically just be appropriated out. So this includes things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I think it also includes like defense programs in there, some of them anyways, but not all of them. And then you have like discretionary spending. And so this money is actually going to be kind of worked upon by members in Congress. So usually Congress tries to set the spending level for that by October 1st every year, but that hasn't happened, I think, in decades. It's been a little messy, but we're hoping for the best. But it does, the discretionary spending does cover programs and appropriation bills. So this includes programs like housing, education programs, USDA programs and stuff like that. And so one of the things that we would love to see like in mandatory spending, it's a dream and it's a heavy lift, but we push a lot for mandatory voucher programs, or a program for mandatory vouchers, and that's more of like a long-term goal of ours. And this graph is just so y'all can kind of see, if you're a visual learner, just how much money we spend on mandatory spending and how much is on discretionary. And housing falls within that discretionary slice of the pie, which is very small. So the first step in the federal budget is that the president will kind of just work alongside the secretaries of federal agencies and departments and kind of determining like the number that they would need to operate. And then the president will take those numbers and submit that proposal out, which is what he did today for Congress to kind of come together and vote on that budget. So Usually after that, you'll have what's called budget resolutions, which usually happens in Congress. And those budgets or those resolutions are usually written by budget committees. But because of the polarization of Congress this year, we're not really sure how, like, it'll be unclear if that resolution will happen. And if it doesn't, there's usually a different way to settle those differences. I think it's called a deeming resolution, where the appropriators will go ahead and just say how much they're going to spend. And there's like not really like a lot of negotiation there, but you don't really have to worry about that. But you do you do just want to kind of keep track of different committees and what they're pushing for. Some of the most important committees will be, oh, I'm so sorry, I keep doing that. I'll try to be more a little longer. But the big things that we usually look at when we're talking about housing again is, transportation, housing, and urban development subcommittee within the appropriations committee, and also any bills in relation to USDA, because a lot of the funding for rural housing programs goes through there as well. And I think too, anything that impacts slide tech, but I think that's through a separate process, so it usually doesn't go through appropriations. So again, those bills get drafted by the Appropriations Committee, and then once it goes through, both the Senate and the House will vote, and then the president will sign it, right? Has it been that easy in recent years? Not really, but we're hoping again for the best this year, and your advocacy is important in that. And you're probably wondering why it's important, and this graph is an excellent example of why. We've seen and I know in the slide here that vouchers and project-based rental assistance have increased over time, but that's only been like the two that have really increased. Everything else has kind of gone in the negative for the federal budget from FY10 to FY20. But for a long time, we've seen strong disinvestments in housing programs, and that'll continue to be the case, especially with the polarization in Congress right now. I think we're kind of trying to be cautious around budget cuts and being aware of how this stuff works, so that when we talk to our members of Congress, we're aware of what's going on and what needs to be done in order to make sure that folks stay safely and stably housed. But does anybody have any questions about that at all? I know it's like a very like policy wonky thing, and I myself am still kind of like learning about the different steps, so I'm happy to answer any questions or refer it on to anybody else who would know. And I'll keep taking breaks throughout the session too to like have y'all ask questions. So if you can't think of anything right now, I can take them later. Cool. So now let's talk about advocacy and why we're here. So what is advocacy and why do we participate? So as you know, or you may not know, is that advocacy is really just educating others about issues we care about and pushing for changes that we want to see in our communities, regardless of whether that's at the federal, state, or local level. And I'm sure that many of you, especially if you're working very closely on the ground, will see that the affordable crisis or the affordable housing crisis is in action every day. And you can have such a tremendous impact just by speaking to your members of Congress at every level, or your elected official at every level of government. So when you're doing advocacy, what really is the goal? So when thinking about advocacy itself, regardless of how you do it, whether it's with a campaign or whether it's not, it's important to keep in mind that the goal of this work is not just to determine where people stand on the issue, but to move them along a spectrum. And it might not always be possible to move them along this spectrum. Folks might be a staunch opponent for a very long time. Some folks might be a staunch supporter for the whole time that you're working with them. But let's say that your elected official is a staunch opponent of affordable housing. Your goal with advocacy is just to make sure that, like, to get them to be a little bit quieter about their objections to affordable housing solutions, so that it's not as harmful for other folks to like hear the negative rhetoric around affordable housing, and then you can push for things that are actually helpful. Or let's say you have somebody who's already a supporter, then your goal will be to nudge them to break out of their comfort zone so that they can be vocal about their stance and make sure that bills are being passed to help folks who need affordable housing. And I'll just make a quick note, kind of discerning the difference between advocacy and lobbying, because I know that's a very huge concern for folks, especially for folks who work out of 501c3s. The biggest thing to note here is just that if you're not taking a position on a specific piece of legislation, you're not lobbying. At least most of what you'll be doing is not lobbying. Whenever something has a number to it, that's when it gets to lobbying. But every organization, including 501c3s, or at least every organization for the most part, has a lobby limit. I think it's called like generous limits that are allowed by federal law. And again, I just want to remind you all that it's the elected officials that y'all work with really rely on the experience and knowledge that y'all know to make their decisions. So make sure that you're speaking to them. So your role as an advocate, your views really matter. Again, I just want to harper down on that point from the last slide, but you play a larger role in the lives of elected officials and their policy choices than you might think. Not only do you hold like that expertise on issues through your work and personal lives, but you also have the ability to vote those folks out and keep them in or out of office. And by sharing those views, you can play a central role in either reinforcing or shifting the thinking of their views on certain issues. And Crystal, I did see your question about sharing the PowerPoint. I'm happy to share it afterwards too. So I'll briefly go over some advocacy methods with you all. So the biggest thing that I'll talk about is kind of just the advocacy meetings and how to have them, how to schedule them, and all that stuff. But I'll also touch on campaigns, events and webinars, and other advocacy tools. So a lot of advocacy organizations, you'll see that they have like different campaigns. For example, later on today, I'll be talking about the House campaign that we have at NLIHC. But in order to create like a campaign, there's a lot of different things that go into it. When you're engaging your members of Congress, the first thing that you really want to make sure that when you're creating a campaign is kind of looking at what your goals are and whether you're trying to create long-term change or short-term change. And that will really inform like the following steps after this. So who are you trying to target? Is it your like city council? Is it your state legislature? Is it, like the school board? Whoever your target is, you want to make sure that you know who it is and you know them well. And then you also want to make sure that you kind of look at who is in your advocacy network already, and is it strong? Are they educated on the issues? What do they need to know? And that will really kind of help you determine like what your next steps are. And you also want to create an agenda. So establish your priorities very clearly and the objectives you'll need to reach your ultimate goal. And then consider what compromises you might be willing to make and where you will need to draw the line in order of what goals you want to achieve. And then you'll be kind of just preparing your messaging. So a lot of folks have been using social media, but there's still a lot of good use in traditional media. You can do written materials that you can share with your community, talking points that you have to prep during meetings. And another big part is also just storytelling and gathering data that you can share with folks. And then broadening your base and mobilizing. This will definitely help any campaign and just like getting the word out and growing it and making sure that folks are aware of the issues. So the next thing that I'll kind of talk about, and Jen, I do see your question in the chat and I'll make sure to answer it during the next question break, but just wanted to give you a heads up that I can see it. So when it comes to advocacy meetings, it's important to make sure that you're aware of what the expectations are. You want to make sure that you're trying to have these as much as possible. It's almost like catching up with a friend, right? Like if you don't talk to them very often, like yes, you can still maintain that friendship, but it can be a little bit harder when you're not staying up to date on everything. So they're just like conversations. Um, and it's also important to like remember to like practice your talking points and to listen to yourself say them, but also making sure that you're listening to the elected official that you're talking to. So how do you prepare for an advocacy meeting? So let's say you're setting one up in Washington. They may want you to call in about 2 weeks before. Oh, and when I say Washington, I mean DC. You might want to call like those offices 2 weeks before, maybe even 3 weeks before. Um, it's kind of a hard line to draw sometimes because depending on whether Congress is in session and voting, sometimes things will be too busy and 2 weeks will be too early. um, but it really just depends. And in District 2, in Texas, depending on what organizations like you're affiliated with or involved in. Like I know a lot of folks have Capitol Hill days, like in the state. And I can't remember if Texas Homeless Network did have one recently. I feel like they have. But Samantha can confirm that in the chat. So there's like different ways to get involved in that. And so when you're prepping for these, you want to make sure that sometimes meeting with the staffer is going to be a lot better than actually meeting with the elected officials because these folks are like the experts and they offer a lot of feedback to the elected official on what they should be doing. So definitely better to meet with the staffer sometimes. And then make sure that you do the research on the office too, like what do they care about, what committees are they on, um, like what background did they have before becoming an elected official. It'll really help you in your relationship building. And then you also want to kind of just establish that tone of partnership that this is like a two-way street. And then again, you'll just want to make sure that you're still prepping any leave behind materials that you want to leave at advocacy meetings. Practice your talking points, like I said earlier. And if you're meeting through a virtual platform, you're going to want to make sure that you have that set up. And ideally, you want to set that up on your end because if you need to show up early and prep people, it'll be kind of awkward if you have to use the elected official Zoom to do that versus yours. And then this link at the bottom of the screen that you'll see is from our website. And I can share that in the chat a little bit later as well, but that just leads you to the little worksheet that I shared earlier today. And then during the advocacy meetings themselves, it can be a little bit daunting if it's like your first time, but I promise you if you just follow these steps and if you go with a group of people, it'll go a little bit easier. So the day of, you're gonna wanna make sure that you arrive early and you know where the office is that you're meeting with. In Congress itself, the meeting will usually be 20 to 30 minutes. And when you get there, you wanna introduce yourself, the organization that you're representing, if it's applicable. You're going to use this opportunity to kind of educate the elected official, not just on your organization, but also on the issue that you're talking about. If you have any like data or like storytelling that you can talk about, definitely put that in there as well. And then you want to make sure that if you're able to, you can connect that to the interest of the elected official. And then right at the very end, when you've like hopefully hooked them onto your story, you're gonna make that ask because that's when they're gonna be like super engaged and you're gonna be able to have their attention. And it's always, always important to make sure that you have any leave behind materials. It doesn't have to be physical. In fact, if you want to email them afterwards, that's a good way of maintaining the relationship and following up with them afterwards too. But always try your best to have like at least one fact sheet. And an example of a fact sheet that you can leave behind, especially for your like federal members of Congress, is our congressional district housing profile, which has data based on different congressional districts in Texas. And we have these for every state. they will be updated when we release our new the gap report on March 16th. So this is a little bit outdated, but we do have new information to share. It's just not right. But March 16th, keep an eye out. And so again, after the advocacy meetings, you just want to make sure that you send a thank you note. When I started advocacy, we would like write letters out and send them like via mail, but a lot of folks do emails now. You want to make sure that you shared what you learned from the office and follow up with them. Usually, I try to do it like once or twice a year, just depending on how busy it is, sometimes more if you're in session like you are right now. And you want to make sure that you just continue to hold them accountable if there's like any events that you can see them at. So then hosting events and webinars. This is a little bit newer, and I wanted to add the slide too, just because I think that this has been a very effective way of being able to talk to elected officials who might not necessarily be in support of like the work, or just like they might be a staunch opponent, like I noted earlier. So if you're holding events with elected officials in your advocacy base, it's really important to make sure that you're exposing them to like the work that's being done locally. So for example, I was in Austin last week, and I think like one of the housing authority folks was able to bring the deputy secretary of HUD to come see like the opening of a new I think it was like a new housing authority or like a unit or like development or something. And that's like honestly a very good way of bringing in people and getting them like up to date on the work you're doing, but also meeting folks who are directly impacted by these policies. But it's also important to make sure that you're, again, mobilizing your base and educating them on the issues that you're trying to spread awareness about. And one of the things that I recommend is working with like local small businesses, like mom and pop shops, to connect with the community and actually have like those teach-ins and have like places where folks can get to know each other a little bit more. And when you're, I forgot to mention this earlier, but if you're like scheduling tours or site visits to affordable housing developments, you want to make sure that you're partnering with organizations that are working across sectors. Because that'll also help mobilize your base. So if you're working with any faith-based groups or any healthcare community-based groups, nonprofits, like those folks will be able to also help grow your movement. And then webinars, especially now as we kind of go into like this hybrid age of advocacy, it'll be really important to mobilize and educate your base. So virtual teach-ins, mobilizing advocates for your policy priorities through different methods that I'll talk about in the next slide. So here are just some other advocacy tools that I'll touch on. So the ongoing advocacy, or the ongoing positive relationship building, as I've kind of touched on before, it's not just a key pillar of advocacy, but it can be like a key pillar to your advocacy campaign, to your meetings, to like literally anything that y'all do when you're doing advocacy. And it's a big factor in how much success like your advocacy has. Social and traditional media are also like another big tool that you can use. For social media, you obviously have like all of these different websites that you can use, but folks often ask us for like examples of what they can do on those websites. One thing that we've done on Twitter specifically has been using what we call Twitter storms. So we'll schedule a time where we have everybody tweet about the same issue at a specific time, and we'll have them like at their elected officials. So we'll be like, I'm from Nevada, so I would be like, at Senator Cortez Masto, like, please support this legislation or something like that. So yeah. And then we also have traditional media that we want folks to take advantage of. Op-eds and letters to the editor, but especially op-eds, which are opinion editorials. They're very effective in getting the attention of elected officials, so definitely engage in those. I think Kansas was recently having like a very huge like bill coming out that was going to criminalize folks experiencing homelessness, and we had one of our partners write an op-ed that recently went out and got a lot of attention too. But there's still a lot of other traditional media that you can use, such as press briefings, and don't forget about the radio. The radio is still important. And then you can also connect directly with decision makers through other ways, such as call-in days. So, that's like your traditional, just like calling the offices on their phone and being like, hey, like, please make sure that this elected official supports affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I touched on meetings earlier. I think somebody asked earlier in the chat about letters and petitions. Those are still effective. And we also use them a lot at the coalition. And I don't have it like on me right now, but there was research done before the pandemic that kind of showed the effectiveness of different advocacy tools. And that one usually like is towards the bottom. But I think I think that research is honestly a little bit outdated because things have definitely changed since the onset of the pandemic. And then again, you can use demonstrations, events, and site visits, like I noted earlier. And then my good colleague, I can't access it right now, but I'll share it with you afterwards. But there's this really good organization in Vermont called Common Good Vermont, and they have a toolkit that y'all can use to kind of just like adapt a lot of what I've taken and talked about, because I'm definitely not like the experts on all things advocacy, but if you're learning about how you can adapt these tools to a more like local, like city, state level type of advocacy, you can look at that toolkit and it'll have some good advice in there for you. Cool. So any questions at all? Let me go back and see that one question. Yeah, so the one question that I saw from Jen was, I often sign online petitions supporting affordable housing and send template emails to elected officials. Is that an effective way to advocate? I think so. And I think it's definitely like a first step. And if you're looking to get like further engaged, I definitely think it would be good to get involved with like local organizations such as like the Texas Homeless Network, which you are doing already. But just like volunteering when you can and doing those call-ins and doing those advocacy meetings. Cool. Any other questions? And no problem, Jen. Thank you for asking. We might end a little bit early then. But I still have like a few slides to get to, but I did want to make sure I save some time at the end for questions. So feel free to continue thinking of some if you have some. So as a nonpartisan group, NLIHC really supports like any good housing policy that helps achieve our mission, regardless of what side of the aisle it comes from. And a good example of that has been like bipartisan legislation such as the Eviction Crisis Act and the Family Instability Vouchers Act. And we've recognized that the good housing policy really affects every person across like every political spectrum, which is why we decide to stay nonpartisan. And thank you to Jen for dropping a toolkit in the chat. But unsurprisingly, much of like the last couple of years has really us been in crisis mode, like trying to make sure that we get emergency measures passed to address the housing instability in the pandemic. And we're still pushing for that so that the next time, let's hope that a crisis doesn't happen, but the next time a crisis does happen, folks are equipped with these safety nets and don't fall into further poverty or housing instability. So I did want to just briefly talk about some of NLIHC's policy priorities. We do kind of update like the number on our policy priorities, but for the last few years, they've stayed the same because we really just want to harper down on the ones that you see on the screen now. And again, you can use these policy priorities to inform your advocacy, but I always encourage you to do your research and find like what would be most effective for you to advocate for in your community. But again, if you have any questions about any of these, we have like experts on our team who can do that. Um, but we do a lot of great work through these priorities. One of the biggest priorities that we have this year, and I kind of touched on it earlier, is making sure that we have increased investments in affordable housing through fiscal year 2024. And so that's the budget that's being worked on right now as we speak. And so we're asking for 6 things in particular, and you'll see them on the screen as well. A lot of it has to do with our long-term goals and sustaining affordable housing for everyone across the country. So we want to make sure that we have full funding for tenant-based rental assistance programs so that we have an additional or expand like contracts and vouchers for folks so that there's affordable housing for an additional 200,000 households. We're going to make sure, or we're going to want to make sure that we have fully funded public housing operations and repairs, and fully funding homeless assistance grants, which will probably impact you all the most. And then through the work that we did with our emergency rental assistance project, which is called Erase, we noticed that there's definitely a deep need for legal assistance to prevent evictions. So we want to make sure that there's a set aside for that. And we also want to make ERA permanent because it did help a lot of people. So we're putting $3 billion in there for ERA. And we also want to increase funding for competitive tribal housing grants for tribes with the greatest needs. So again, these are our asks, and you'll probably see different asks from national groups across the country, but this is kind of what we're looking for. And we'll continue to ask for it, of course. It'll look different depending on what the president released earlier today, and unfortunately I didn't get a chance to read through it before we hopped on this call, so I can't really tell you if this is going to happen or not. But again, Congress still has to work on it and create like their own version of the budget before it gets passed. So it's really important right now for y'all to reach out to your members of Congress and ask them to make sure that they fully fund and increase the funding of housing programs this year. And I'll give you an opportunity to engage in that advocacy in just a moment. But before I do that, I did want to touch on our Housed campaign really briefly. So the NLIHC House campaign is really built upon creating long-term solutions to the housing crisis. So advancing anti-racist policies to kind of reverse a lot of like the racist housing policies that have passed in the past, and have large-scale sustained investments and reforms necessary to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. And we're really pushing for bold policies so that we can make sure that folks with the lowest incomes and the most marginalized people have a stable and affordable home. So we're still kind of in the process of pushing like a lot of the bills that we have supported through this campaign, and we understand that it's not just going to be like a thing that happens within this Congress or maybe even next Congress. It'll take folks like you and folks like you across the nation to make sure that we get our goals accomplished. And so the 4 things that we really push for in this campaign is making sure that we pass some sort of universal rental assistance, regardless of what that looks like. But we just want to make sure that it is universal and that it reaches folks most in need. We also want to increase and preserve the supply of affordable rental homes, including preserving rental public housing, because we know that that's been in deep disarray for a long time. We want to provide ERA, again, like I said, emergency rental assistance to folks who are in crisis. And we also want to enact legislation that would protect renters at the federal level. So things like source of income protection, right to counsel, like fair housing protections, things that would make it easier for folks to stay housed and not experience discrimination. Yeah, and then again, I don't know, I thought I would be able to copy and paste the links, but I can't, but I promise I'll follow up with a lot of links for this stuff later. So Currently, we have like two specific like opportunities to, there's a lot more. We have like a lot of ways to get engaged, but the two that I did want to highlight was just again expanding affordable housing resources in the FY24 budget. And then our end goal really is just to have like universal rental assistance. I think right here it says Ending Homelessness Act, which was still relevant last year, but I think right now we're really pushing towards the Eviction Crisis Act because it is a bipartisan act that will likely pass with enough support this year. Not this year, but within this Congress. So yeah. It is now your turn. This is like the interactive portion of the presentation, but I understand that it's a little bit harder to like keep track of that virtually. But I'll go ahead and see if I can share that link with you all so that you can have it in the chat. So at NLIHC, we do have like a legislative action center, which lists different ways to contact your members of Congress on different issues that matter to you. And currently we have an asks out for making sure that we fully fund and increase the funding of affordable housing programs in the federal budget. And so if you go to that link, it'll be like the first box that you find. If you want to click on that, it'll take you to a screen that'll look something like this, except it'll say 2024, not 2023. Yeah, and then you can kind of go through that and fill it out. And I think Jen was kind of alluding to earlier was that it's kind of like an email template. So if you scroll down, you'll kind of see something that has text that looks like this, where it says like, as your constituent, I'm urging you to ensure that affordable housing programs are funded at the highest level possible. But it does give you some opportunity to kind of edit and change that and put in like your own personal story. So here on the screen, you're gonna see like my own personal story, but I definitely encourage y'all to put that piece in there because that's really what hooks people on. I've heard often from many folks and many advocates that it's really like your personal experience versus the data that makes a difference. So please make sure you put that in there. But yeah, I would encourage y'all to do that. You can do it now, you can do it afterwards, but definitely try to do it sometime today when you get a chance. So that your elected officials know that you're thinking about this and that it matters. Cool. So the last thing, so somebody in the chat asked what do you do when you click the link. So there will be like a few boxes that are on the screen. And so when, oh wait, hold on, it's not this, it's this one. So when you get to the page, this is what it looks like on the desktop, but on the phone, it should look something like this almost, but you're gonna wanna click the one that says expand affordable housing resources in the federal budget. And then again, you can feel free to write your own text. And then NLIHC is a membership-based organization, and a lot of the work that we do honestly wouldn't be possible without folks like y'all. And I love this graphic. I'll take off like my background in a second, but I think it's behind me and I'll show it to y'all. But it really is like our members that make up like a lot of our base and actually are able to help us get like the point across, because like members of Congress don't want to listen to us, like they want to listen to you and your stories. So if you're interested in becoming a member, again, I'll drop that link in the chat in a second, but honestly, usually folks can join for anywhere from like $100 to like $15, but even $1 makes a difference. So I'm not the one that's gonna like police you on how much you should give, but it really does make a difference for us. And then yeah, I guess we can open it up to Q&A now. How to do that, but I'm happy to drop my email in the chat too if anybody has any questions and stuff. stop sharing my screen too. I think if anybody wants to like verbally ask the question too, I should be able to unmute you if you want to raise your hand. Like towards the bottom of your screen where it says reactions, you can raise your hand and I can allow you to talk and ask your question verbally so that we can have like a back and forth.
Great.
Yeah, there you go.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Awesome. Cool. I was wondering if you had any advice for folks that were maybe looking to get involved like at a local level. If you could say anything about like maybe more localized advocacy. And do you think any of that like local advocacy trickles up, or I don't know how, if if there's any communication between like local governments and like folks in Washington. Do you have any insight into that? It sounds like two questions, doesn't it? I think I have my question is mostly about the how local advocacy, if that has any effect on like what's going on, local advocacy to local officials, if that has any effect on like statewide and national elected officials.
I would say yes. But that's just like based on like my perspective of like how things are transitioned between city, local, and state government to federal government.
Mhm.
One thing that always kind of talk about with folks is getting involved in obviously you have like your like very big organizations, statewide organizations, like the Texas Homeless Network that are doing really great things. But you also want to make sure that at the city level, I can't remember if there's one in Austin, but I know that like throughout Texas, there's organizations such as like the Texas Tenants Union, and the Texas Tenants for Change. I think there's like an organization called BASTA, which is BASTA. I can't remember what it stands for though, but they're folks who like you know have like that lived experience and like are forming like these smaller like grassroots organizations that really like need a lot of support, and I think those folks if given like that support could really make a big like what do you call it, can make like a big wave like in local and municipal government. How they do that, there's like a lot of different strategies on how to do that. And I've seen like a variety of them through the work that I do. You know, like I said, some of them do hold like, you know, those site visits and those tours, and I've seen folks kind of just have like, you know, I'm trying to think. There's like I definitely think there's like some sort of like cultural competence aspect to it too. For example, like folks who want to hold like a taco night in like a community that's like predominantly like Latinx to like garner support from folks who might be experiencing like housing instability in a specific neighborhood that's like mostly like Latinx and stuff. So that might be like a good way to get folks involved. So whether that trickles up, I guess answering that question, um, through I can't give you like a good definitive answer on that because I feel like it'll look different for everyone, but I do think from like my own experience, like one thing that I've been working on is making sure that we're uplifting the voices of tenants throughout the country in the work that we personally do at NLIHC. So one example that I can give you is a tenant leader cohort that we have at NLIHC, which takes folks who have lived experience and we educate them on how to be an advocate and take that back to their community. And last year, they were actually invited along to the White House to talk with officials about like tenant protections and housing affordability. And it wasn't just them either. Like, obviously, the White House is like very keen to what's going on, and they like want to hear more. So they invited folks from across the country from different groups, not just like our cohort either. So it appears to me that there's interest, and hopefully it'll stay that way. But yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Of course. And I'll put you back in the webinar mode now, but if you have any other questions, feel free to raise your hand. Cool. No worries, Eddie. Does anybody else have any other questions? Apologies that my Teams is just going off if you can hear that. Samantha, I think we're good to wrap up now. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions, but I'm glad again to follow up with any links and resources so that folks have that available.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and send you all out an email. Since Sid will have some things to include too, we'll probably send it out next week just to give everyone time to get things together. But we'll send it to you soon, and the presentation, and we'll have the recording on our website. Otherwise, I think we'll end early. And again, thank you so much, Sid. I really appreciate you always showing up and spreading so much wisdom all the time. I learn something new every time you talk. So thank you for being here. And I hope that everyone else has a good rest of their day.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.